So in this video I'm going to discuss neutralization and titration. So titration is a laboratory method in which we can determine the concentration of an acid or a base with another acid or a base by utilizing a neutralization reaction. So let's say we were to find a bottle in the lab and all it said was hydrochloric acid on it, but we weren't sure what concentration that was. It could be 16 molar and very dangerous. It could be 0.1 molar and potentially not hazardous at all. So by using a neutralization reaction, we can determine the concentration of that acid. So for this reaction, we need an indicator. So the indicator can help us to see when the neutralization of the acid with the base has occurred. And the most commonly used indicator for a titration is called phenolphthalein. And phenolphthalein is colorless when it's in an acid or when it's neutral, but it turns pink when it's in a base. So how we're going to do this is we're going to measure out a specific volume of an acid of unknown concentration and you place it into a flask. So we know the correct volume, like say 50 milliliters of this acid that we don't know the concentration. Then we add indicator to the acid. So if we use the phenolphthalein as we add the indicator, the solution should stay colorless. Then we take a base of known concentration and we slowly add until the indicator changes color. So that point where it goes from being clear to just starting to become pink will be the point that we know that we've crossed over and become basic. So right there, that point is called the end point, and we know that's the point at which the perfect neutralization has happened. So then after we have added the base, we are going to measure the volume of the base that we have added so that we can compare the volume of the base that was required to neutralize the volume of the unknown concentration of the acid. So the solution of known concentration, so in the last example that would be the base, is called the standard solution. And in order to measure the volume that we use an instrument called a burette, which is a very tall, long, skinny, sort of graduated cylinder that has a glass tip. And it has a valve here that we can open and close and allow the base to drain slowly from the burette. So we continue adding this base to our acid, which would be in a flask underneath here, just until the indicator changes color, and then we turn it off. And because there's a scale on the side here, we know how much base we have added to that acid. So the point, like I said, just where it starts to change color is called the end point. Now if we look at this is a titration curve. So a titration curve shows when the pH versus milliliters of titrant, or the solution that we have added, and shows the end point. Okay, so on the left here we have an acid sample that's titrated with a base. So that's the example we've been giving, an unknown acid. So it's going to start with a low pH, and as we add base to it, the pH slowly starts to increase, and then it increases, and the point at which it reaches a pH of 7 where it's neutral, the neutralization has happened, that is called the end point. Now if we were continued to add more base, then our phenolphthalein would become more and more pink, and the pH would increase up until we get to close to 14. Alright, now if we were to have an opposite scenario where, say, we had a base of unknown concentration and we were titrating it with an acid, then we would start with a pH higher than 7, and as we added the titrant, which would be an acid now, the pH would slowly increase until we got to the end point, which would be right at 7, and then if we continued to add acid, the pH would decrease. Now if we did it in this case, we would start with a pink phenolphthalein solution, and as soon as we got it to the end point, it would become clear. Whereas over here, it starts clear, and then after we reach the end point, it turns pink. So we're going to perform a titration in the lab. Now, how do we actually then use the data that we get, the volume that we get, to figure out the concentration of the unknown acid or base? And it's very easy because we're going to be using the dilution equation that we already learned. So we would say the molarity of the acid times the volume of the acid used. So in our case, the molarity of the acid would be the unknown, and the volume of the acid we'd measure out a very specific amount and put in our flask at the beginning of the experiment, would be equivalent to the molarity of the base, so that would be our known titrant, so we would know the molarity of that, and then the volume of the base would be what we use the burette to find out once we had reached the endpoint. So we could solve for the molarity of the acid. So we're going to perform this important laboratory experiment in class.